the EscapeGoat podcast. A podcast series featuring the discussion of many different topics, flaws and all, based on personal whims and fascinations. Hosted by me, David Fagiani, and several different guests. Hello, and welcome to episode 20, staggeringly, of the EscapeGoat podcast. Can't quite believe I've got there. What a busy few months this has been. But I'm very, very pleased to welcome first-time guest on the show, my friend Nannina. How are you doing, Nannina? You all right?
I'm doing okay.
Yeah, good. Would you like to tell the listeners, assuming they exist, where you're talking to me from?
I'm talking to you from Massachusetts, in the United States of America.
Mm-hmm. I've heard of it.
And more specifically in the western part of the state, as far away from Boston as you can get and still be in Massachusetts.
I see. That wasn't a deliberate decision on your part. You're not trying to keep distance between yourself and Boston.
No, I was just born here. So.
I see. Me and Nannina went to university together in Scotland about a decade ago now, wasn't it?
Over.
Yeah, over a decade ago. Yeah, frightening. It's when you start being able to. I was just talking to I'm staying with my mum at the moment in the north of England, and I was just talking to her the other day about how scary it gets when you can watch Friends reruns, and even the late Friends reruns are past the stage of life you're at. You know, that's terrifying when you've gone through the entire phase. You know, all the phases they go through.
Yep. Does that mean we're grown-ups now?
I think I'm not prepared to concede that point. Yeah, you know, we'll get there, I'm sure, but no, not in my book. So how's things been for you recently? How's it going over there? The big month for the US, obviously.
Well, I think that definitely there was a collective exhale once all of the votes had been tabulated, and that it was interesting to realize how much sort of tension because the last 4 years, one has gotten so used to the amount of tension. So I was thinking, it will be, if it's Biden, it will be a relief. And if it's not, it will be kind of steeling yourself for another long haul. But I wasn't quite prepared for how relieved I was. I when I saw on the New York Times website that it had been called in Biden's favor, I literally ran outside to Joe and was like, Biden. So, yeah, that's been a bit of an exhale, but there's definitely still a bit of a road to go with everything, and a lame duck in office.
Yeah, well, we've still got, is it about 2 months? We're recording this on the 21st of November, so there's still 2 months about till the inauguration, I think.
Yeah.
It's almost seems like designed to give people nerves, doesn't it? That period.
Yes, but I'm in hope that it will, in the end, be a smooth transition. But I really think what's the lame duck is doing now is a real sort of problem. Like it goes against democracy.
It's a bit of a problem, isn't it?
Yeah.
We should say for people who follow American politics, maybe perhaps not so closely, the state that you're in, Massachusetts, is not not what you call a swing state, is it? Or at least hasn't been. No. It's a safely democratic state.
Yeah. It's interesting though, because it's a very blue area of a very blue state, but I do come from a more conservative family, so I do get both sides, which is both interesting and sometimes scary, and sometimes good to not live in an entire echo chamber. But...
Yeah, I was aware from talking to you previously that, you know, some of your sort of elder relatives are sort of Republicans, aren't they, and kind of members of the sort of more pre-Trump, you might say, more traditional Republican sort of establishment. what have I mean, I could probably more interesting than what either of us think about this kind of thing is how have they been weathering the last 4 years?
I mean, it's hard to say exactly because, yeah, I think that it's a very conflicting time for people like that, and I feel like it actually shouldn't be. I mean, I've for most of my sort of voting life have considered myself independent.
Mm-hmm.
I am not registered to a party, which actually is useful because it means that I can vote in whatever primary I want. So in 2016, it meant that I could vote in the Republican primary because I was like, this is the important one to be voting in. And I wish that more people had paid attention to the 2016 Republican primary, rather than being like, "Oh, nothing's gonna happen. It's fine." But yeah, it's been a rough 4 years, and even for people who are conservative, who in general go against a lot of the things that Trump stands for, sometimes there is a bit of a party allegiance that can be frustrating when you're like, but this is actively damaging, actively going against things that you believe in.
As you see it, as you see what their central tenets should be.
Yeah. So that's been tough. But I think that it also helps one understand that there are humans on both sides of the political aisle.
I don't think you can say on both sides now. I think that phrase has become ruined.
Yeah, I know. But I don't think that it's helpful to completely demonize people on either side, because then no one's going to listen. One should definitely condemn anything that will harm another human being, and definitely you don't need to soft pedal things. But once you deny sort of the humanity of people on either side, then they're not going to listen. Yeah. And I think that listening is very important.
Yeah, well, I know we're talking about, especially with the more extreme elements of the Trump administration, things like their border policies and stuff. I know we're talking about very, very emotive and rightly so issues. But I suppose you go back to that kind of truism, don't you, that even Republican voters do not necessarily vote for and endorse everything a Republican candidate then goes on to do. I know that sounds like a bit of a get out clause, but that's the case for anyone who votes for a politician. Well, for most people who vote for politicians, isn't it? They are only somewhat aware of elements of the policy platform, and elements of the policy platform change, evolve in all kinds of directions. So that's not to write everyone a sort of get out of jail free card for their political choices, but that's just the reality of how most democratic decisions work,
Yeah, and I think that, as you said, it's very important not to write a get out of jail free card, because there are some incredibly damaging things that have happened with this administration. But I think the more things get polarized, the more people go to extreme beliefs that they don't actually hold. And that it means that they think, well, if people were so extreme about this thing that I actually believe, then maybe they're just overreacting about this other thing, which seems a little bit on the edge, but and none of this is good, but all of it is very human. And I don't pretend that I don't have, like, I'm not right all the time, but yeah, humans are messy and complicated, and yeah.
You are right. You are right most of the time, though. You're doing yourself a bit of a disservice there.
I don't know.
I wanted to ask you about how things are going, because I mean, more sort of in terms of your sort of daily routine and the way you earn a living, etc. Where you are in the States, because the UK, as I say, late November, I'm talking to you now. We're in in England, we are in a sort of full lockdown, akin to kind of what we were doing back in April, May, June, really. So most things are closed, most public venues are closed, bars are closed, cinemas are closed again. And this is an attempt, and listeners listening to this in future times will know how effective it was or not to get the hospital admission figures down back to controllable levels, obviously with a huge bias in terms of being in time for Christmas. When I look at the figures from the States in general, I mean, I know you're a much bigger country, obviously, but I just get terrified. How are things going over there, and how are things feeling, you know?
Well, I think that your point about it being a bigger country is actually very relevant, because different states are handling things very differently.
Mm-hmm.
And in Massachusetts, we've been pretty good, especially in my little corner of the state, which is pretty rural. People are sort of socially distanced anyway.
A default, yeah.
And also a majority of the people in this area are taking things seriously. That said, in this month, it's been the first, I've known quite a few people who have had COVID, but they have all been in different states. Either they were down in New York City or New Orleans or Seattle. And now there are cases that are closer in the Berkshires, and cases in the Berkshires are going up for the first time, basically in the entirety of the pandemic. And so it's feeling a little bit sort of nearer at hand.
I see.
That a few of the restaurants around me in the small town that I live in have had to close because wait staff or kitchen staff have tested positive. And so I think that in general, people around here are taking it seriously. There's a good amount of mask compliance, but it is definitely an issue and just something that one's trying to navigate.
Yeah, of course. And you of course work in the service industry yourself, don't you? So what's your 2020 been like in terms of that, and what are you doing at the moment?
Well, so I work in a coffee shop, and we closed in March and reopened June 1st. And when we reopened, we actually set up a really good system, which was just a takeaway window system on the porch that the coffee shop actually was remarkably well suited for, and had a nice flow of traffic. And basically all of us employees at the shop are wanting to maintain this as long as possible. And we're in a little bit of a standoff with the owner, who's like, when it gets cold, we'll have to let some people inside. And she's not saying let people inside to sit and drink their coffee. She's like, let 2 customers in at once, and they get their coffee and they leave. But all of us are like, if our system ain't broke, let's just keep going on it. None of us want to let anyone inside. There's just something so nice and unambiguous about the takeaway window system. And also 95% of people have their masks on and are all set with that. You do get a few people who just in good faith forgot to put their mask on, and if they're outside, you can just keep the window closed and be like gesture to them, put on the mask. And then there are the people that argue with you, and you can just not open the window. But if they're inside, then suddenly that takes on a different tone.
Yeah,
so
definitely. Is it a small is it an independent coffee shop you work for? Yes. Or a small, is it fully independent?
Fully independent. Only one in the world.
Got you. My brother, who's been on the show before, he works in the UK for a coffee chain. It's one of the larger chains that operates here, and they've been. This is like the most corporate shill type thing that you'll ever hear me say on this podcast. But they've actually been pretty good to him. Like, he's been in a pretty lucky position, like that. You know, the kind of furlough money over here, for example, for the portions of the year that the shop itself was fully closed, have been fairly generous, and they're also continuing to treat him fairly well. Obviously, in saying that, they let go all their 0 hours workers absolutely straight away, and anyone with less of a kind of solid contract than my brother obviously were just immediate victims of cutbacks and rationalizations, etc. But I mean, at the moment, like takeaway coffee shops are open in the UK, and tea shops, etc. And that's about the only. I mean, that and the occasional deli is about the only thing that's operating to any extent. All the bars are currently closed. We're getting that reviewed in early December. Obviously, over in the UK, there's quite a lot of news at the moment, about the sort of quasi-federal approach of the UK polity, because Scotland has devolved affairs over health, so does Wales, Northern Ireland. So they are handling things a little bit differently from the way England's handling them. And obviously, England itself was splitting down into regional demarcations in terms of how it handled things. As I say, we're currently in an all-England system. But we were talking before about the transition period from the Trump administration to the Biden administration, which we assume is happening. Although I think currently, as we speak, the Biden administration is not being given access to sort of key pandemic handling processes, is it, in the way that transitions normally work? Do you think Massachusetts is handling things in a fairly balanced, appropriate way compared to the way some other states are doing it? Or would you like to see things go tighter, less tight? Thoughts?
I think that Massachusetts at the moment is handling things pretty well. It is such a difficult thing to know exactly the level that one should keep things open or shut things down. I personally don't think indoor dining is a great idea at the moment. And that is still allowed, but it is very tricky to figure out the levels of how much things should be open or closed. And I think in general, Massachusetts has walked a pretty good line throughout. But we are entering, as people kept warning us, the second wave. And yeah, who knows what's going to happen. But I, in general, felt reasonably safe in the area that I'm in.
We were probably always heading into something of a second wave, obviously, as we reached the end of this year, and particularly as outdoor socializing became less pleasant and easy. But obviously in the UK, quite a big controversy has been over the government's measures to encourage dining out in the summer. We had something called the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, which was launched by our Conservative Chancellor, with the express purpose of encouraging people back out into the wild, so to speak, into risk zones and to boost the economy and to boost the service industry. So that's a bit of we've got so many controversies brewing at the moment and so many imperatives that it's hard to know if that even ranks in the top 30. But I think when we finally get an inquiry, independent or otherwise, that'll be one of the things that comes up is, did we encourage people back to dining too easily with financial motivations in mind? And was that helpful? Was it inevitable? Was it just something we were going to a bullet we were going to have to bite, essentially? And I don't think that debate's going to go anywhere in Britain in the near future.
Yeah, it is a really complicated thing to thread the needle on it. And I mean, knowing various small business owners, I can understand their fears, especially in the food industry, but also their fears can't take precedent over people's safety. And just, that balance of not destroying people's livelihoods, but also not destroying people's lives. And both need to be taken into account. But I do lean more in the direction of one than the other.
I see. Obviously, the main reason of having you on the podcast today is to talk about a movie. So this is kind of like a final aspect to this chat. But before we move on to the main meat of the issue, but not the main meat of the issue, but the main topic at hand is I just wondered how your media consumption has been going over the last sort of few months. What's been keeping you sane? What movies you've been watching? Have you got into any TV?
Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
That's very succinct. Yeah. I know John, who was on the last episode of the podcast, would give you a big thumbs up for that. He's a big fan.
I've been doing a complete rewatch of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which is even better than I remember it.
I was going to ask, is that holding up well? But I see you.
According to me, it's holding up well. And then mostly just a lot of classic films. My sort of pet thing within the history of cinema is classic films directed by women, because I feel like it's such a ignored part of cinema that I didn't even really know about it until like 5 years ago. And by now I've realized how many women were out there directing. I mean, obviously, it was still a tiny minority, but usually their output was quite high caliber because it needed to be in order for them to be able to get far enough to be a director. And so I've just been enjoying watching films by like Dorothy Arzner and Wendy Toy, and on the earlier side, Lois Weber and Alice Guy and Jacqueline Audry, and just there are so many more than people think. So I think that the more that it gets brought up, the more these films will become available.
Well, you're very good at using your Twitter account to highlight some of those things. You've certainly taught me a lot over the last few years about a lot of those obscurities. You know,
my Twitter account is basically purely early women film director Twitter.
I mean, it's good to have a raison d'etre, isn't it, online? Yeah. No, I think you very effectively do that. And how's your writing been? How's that going?
Oof, that's been writing has been hard. There's definitely been this idea in some circles that, oh, well, the lockdown was basically, you could turn it into a writer's retreat. And I don't know, I'm a pretty kind of emotionally sensitive person, and my brain could not get into I would go through little phases of being able to write, and then just staring at the screen or not being able to even open the document is often. And I've been working on a screenplay with a director for almost 2 years now, and she's amazing. She's a really incredible person and a really motivated person, and I know how much work it is for her to be as productive as she is. I'm not saying that she's just magically one of those productive people and that it's just easy for her. It's not. She is focused and she gets stuff done. But I definitely feel a little bit like, I'm not you though, and I have not actually been that productive during this time, and I'm sorry.
Are you able to talk about what that screenplay is about? Or?
Yes, the screenplay is about a religious community that was actually throughout the sort of northeast of America, the even going as far afield as Kentucky, called the Shakers. They had their height sort of in the early 1800s, and they were a celibate utopian community. And they do still exist. There are 3 of them left up in Maine, but in general, the sort of back in the early 1800s, there were dozens of communities. And
when you say 3 of them left, you mean 3 communities, not 3 individuals?
No, I mean 3 individuals.
Not like pandas, you know?
Yeah, like pandas.
Yeah. Okay.
There's one community, but I think the Shakers themselves feel a little bit defensive when people act like, oh, well, it's obviously died out, because I think that within that community up in Sabbath Day Lake, Maine, they have a church and people who are not officially Shakers, but I think that to them, they have quite a vibrant community surrounding this church. And so when people are like, haha, the Shakers are completely died out because, you know, they were celibate, the Shakers themselves take a bit of offense at that, because they're like, look, we have this church surrounding us in a community. But the story that we're dealing with in the screenplay is of 2 Shakers who in 1871 eloped from Hancock Shaker Village, which is nearby where I live. They went to Albany, they got married, and then the next day they came back. And the man was saying that this was a horrible mistake and a momentary lapse, and that they wanted to become part of the community again. Mm-hmm. Eliza was less wanting to come back. And she did in the end leave the community entirely and moved out to Michigan. But it's been a really fun research project, and trying to get into the heads of these people and why they made the choices that they did, why they did elope, why it didn't stick, and also exploring the community itself, because in the 1870s, it was starting to be on the decline. It didn't necessarily look like it was on the decline, but that was sort of the beginning of the end.
That sounds so fascinating. I can't wait to see the finished product. There
Yeah,
you go.
me
Emotional
too.
blackmail. There you go. Hopefully that'll help. Well, I'll what we'll do is we'll take a short break, and then I'll play some atmospheric music, which hopefully is I own the copyright to, and we will come back, me and Nannina, and we'll talk about the main focus of this podcast. See you in a sec.
Married my wife in the month of June. Nicotine, nicotine, now, and I courted her home by the light of the moon. Nicotine, nicotine, hey, John Dapperty, Willity, Wallity, Rustical, Twallity, nicotine, nicotine, now. When me and the old woman got ready to start, nicotine, nicotine, now, I said, old woman, jump into the cart. Nicotine, nicotine, hey, John Dafferty, Willity, Wallity, Rustical, Twallity, nicotine, nicotine, now. She weighs in a lump about 300 pounds. Nicotine, nicotine, now. When she sits on a chair, the thing breaks down. Nicotine, nicotine, hey, John Dafferty, Willity, Wallity, Rustical, Twallity, nicotine, nicotine, now. She stutters when she tries to talk. Nicotine, nicotine, now. She winks and blinks like a great big dog. Nicotine, nicotine, hey, John Dafferty, Willity, Wallity, Rustical, Twallity, nicotine, nicotine, now. She combs her hair but once a year. Nicotine, nicotine, now, and every time it brings a tear. Nicotine, nicotine, hey, John Dafferty, Willity, Wallity, Rustical, Twallity, nicotine, nicotine, now. She churns the butter in her daddy's old boot. Nicotine, nicotine, now, and for a dash she uses her foot. Nicotine, nicotine, hey, John Dafferty, Willity, Wallity, Rustical, Twallity, nicotine, nicotine, now. She washes the pigs in the kitchen sink. Nicotine, nicotine, now. She makes the black ones all turn pink. Nicotine, nicotine, hey, John Dafferty, Willity, Wallity, Rustical, Twallity, nicotine, nicotine, now. She baked me a pie and she called it mint. Nicotine, nicotine, now, and I haven't seen a well-day since. Nicotine, nicotine, hey, John Dafferty, Willity, Wallity, Rustical, Twallity, nicotine, nicotine, now.
Welcome back. So, Nannina, the main reason I asked you on the podcast today was for this 20th episode was to talk about one of my favorite movies. In fact, I shared this with you before the podcast, but a few years ago, me and my friend Chris were talking about favorite movies, and we gave each other the exercise where you know, because obviously anyone can make lists of the favorite movies, you know, ad infinitum, or break them down by genre, or, you know, the specific periods or anything like that. But we gave ourselves the sort of mutually sadistic task of coming up with our 5 favorite movies with only 5 minutes to think about it. So I did that, and it's kind of, you know, I've talked to enough people and made them do the same thing over the last few years that my own choices then are kind of etched onto my mind, you know. So my list actually, I mean, yeah, I might as well get up front. I'll ask for yours at the end because I know you've made one in preparation.
And you are sadistic for asking that.
I do apologize, but mine up front was Goodfellas, The Time Machine, which you know, we'll return to mentioning that in a minute. Alien, Superman Returns, controversially to some, and The Birds, the Alfred Hitchcock movie, The Birds, from '63, which is the main thing I've invited you on to talk about. One thing I realized about my list was shortly after making it, because obviously you can psychoanalyze these lists to death and see what they say about you, especially when you have so little time to rationally think them out, is that I'd ended up with 2 movies with Rod Taylor in them, and 2 movies actually with Veronica Cartwright in them as well, because Veronica Cartwright is you know, the little girl in The Birds, and also ends up an alien later in a arguably even more traumatic situation, which is strange. So big shout outs to Rod Taylor and Veronica Cartwright for apparently dominating my subconscious. But yeah, the reason I asked you to talk about the birds, Nannina, is that it's kind of, I mean, for one thing, I although it's one of my favorite movies, I haven't seen it in a few years, so I took the opportunity to rewatch it, as I know you did, in preparation for this podcast. I also reread the Daphne Du Maurier story, which it's barely based on, but which is the kernel of the idea for it, which I'd read as a teenager, I hadn't read since then. So that was interesting. But I just wanted to ask you quickly, before we get into discussion of the movie, like what's your background with Hitchcock movies and with the birds particularly?
I was trying to think of when I first saw the birds. When I was a young teenager, my mom and I started to get into watching classic films together, and Hitchcock featured very prominently in that. And we'd just go to the video store and rent what they had available. So I think that it was sometime in high school that I first saw the birds during that time, which was a lot of fun to be doing that together. My most memorable experience of the birds was actually at university with the New Picture House would do 11 o'clock retrospective movies. And one time it was the birds. So getting to see it on the big screen was pretty nice. It was very effective to see it on the big screen and a lot of fun. And I took Joe with me. And when it came to the end of the film, he was really annoyed. And like, why did they do that? Well, like, how does it end that way? And then like the next day he was like, wow, that was a great film. So yeah. But I've always been a Hitchcock fan from the point where I think that the first Hitchcock film that I saw was probably Rear Window, which is one of my favorites of his. And I have not seen his entire of. In fact, in order to prepare for this, I saw one movie that I hadn't seen before, which was Marnie.
Me too. I watched that about 3 days ago. Yeah.
Yeah.
First time. I should say the main reason we both watched Marnie was it's the only other movie that Hitchcock made with Tippi Hedren, the star of the birds.
Yeah, he's just a fascinating director on so many different levels. And also just supremely entertaining is the other thing. Like, one can analyze him to the ends of the earth and have a lot of fun doing that. But when it comes down to it, you just on a surface level, he made sure that his films were entertaining and that you didn't need to analyze them deeply. They hold up to an analysis, but they're just very visceral experiences.
I always think Hitchcock's one of those strange figures who's kind of, I mean, obviously in a very real material way, he bridges the sort of silent and sound film eras and things like, the British early sound film eras and his Hollywood phase. But he's also one of those, like, just in himself, he's one of those figures that sort of almost seems to like bridge the 19th and 20th centuries, isn't he? Like, literally a late Victorian by birth, and his incredible kind of manner, just the way he presented himself and the way he was sort of deeply traditional and conventional in some ways, but so obviously incredibly focused on perverse and odd, obsessive psychoanalysis informed art and sort of perception and stuff. He just seems like this kind of slightly impossible figure, doesn't he? That he has so much to him and to his work, obviously.
I was just thinking as you were saying that in some ways he's a little bit like Miss Marple, who always sort of talks about how the more modern people actually are much more easily shocked than her generation, which just was aware of how perverse everything is, and that reversal of the sort of expectation that, the older generation have a bit of an innocence to them, while the younger generation is so much more progressive and permissive.
Well, actually, Agatha Christie's a great comparison, isn't she? Because you could argue she offers in literature, she's occupies a similar space as kind of like a weirdly conservative but perversely horrific kind of figure.
Yeah, and I think also in the way that she is also supremely entertaining, and the entertainment of her books, I think, often overshadows the actual craft that she put into them. And I think that she is as open to being analyzed and studied as Hitchcock is, though I think that she gets a little bit more the sort of, well, she's just kind of light potboiler entertainment. But I love both of them. I think that they're both very good artists in their crafts.
Yeah, both like superb like pop artists, I guess, pop culture artists, and both I suppose like both really good at engaging with what you might call the sensational. I like both in terms of subject matter, lurid murder cases, etc. They're almost like great artists who had like a touch of the National Enquirer to both of them, aren't they? They never quite lost that instinct for what would sell, what would be the headline of any given pitch or project. What would really drag people in through a combination of sort of car crash fascination and just sort of lingering oddness. And talk about the birds. Obviously, we both read the Daphne Du Maurier story, didn't we? This week. Not all Hitchcock's things are based on or adaptations of literary material, although quite a few of them are. Really, if you go into Rebecca and Marnie itself, and obviously
about half.
That sounds about right. Yeah. I mean, Rebecca obviously being a Du Maurier story in origination as well. I hadn't read the birds. We had this lying around. It's my mum's book, so I picked it up off the shelf the other day, and I read it as a teenager, and I didn't remember much about it. But I both remembered and had read recently that it didn't have that much in common on a sort of plot level with the birds. Although I suppose the basic premise is the same as the movie in the sense that birds inexplicably start en masse attacking people in a sort of isolated like coastal village in the, I think it's implied to be in Du Maurier's sort of home of Cornwall in the book, or at least in the southwest of England. What was your take on that? Rereading that, because I find it very interesting. Actually, I have something to say about it in a sec, but your take first.
I really enjoyed it. I love Daphne Du Maurier. Rebecca is one of my favorite books, which actually means that it's one of my least favorite Hitchcock films.
That sounds like there's a whole other podcast in that.
Yes. But I thought it was hugely atmospheric. I found it interesting in how close it felt to World War II. I mean, I think it was written in 53. You might have already
52,
said
53, yeah. So roughly 10 years before the film, yeah.
And it's really, in some ways, processing the experience of having been in England during the war. And you don't get any sort of parallel like that in the film of the birds. And I don't think that necessarily the film is poorer for it. And I don't think the short story and the film are both very good and both very different. And I wouldn't actually put one above the other.
It's interesting in that period, you get Du Maurier writes that story. I was looking this up and doing some sort of date checking just to make sure I was getting my facts right. But in that period of a few years, you get, I think first you get Day of the Triffids coming out, and then you get the Du Maurier story, The Birds, and then you get, I think, I Am Legend being published. And they have so much, if you were to do a Venn diagram of them and their influence on sort of future horror cinema and sort of especially sort of survivalist apocalyptic horror, there's an awful lot going on there, isn't there? And I think it might not be, we'll get onto this a bit more when we talk about the movie, but I think that might not be unconnected to the sort of early Cold War time. And as you say, the long shadow of the Second World War as well. And, the Blitz, particularly, I think, from Du Maurier's perspective.
And the main character in the short story, in some way, he's on disability after the war. He only has to work 3 days a week. So there is that aspect of these deep scars from World War II. And he talks about how he had to board up his mother's windows in Plymouth during the Blitz and all of that. So I hadn't really associated the fact of the sort of terror coming from the sky really resonated in England during that time. The other thing that I found interesting about the short story was the way that I kind of related to it during this pandemic.
I'm glad you said that, because I was going to bring that up if you didn't. Yeah.
Yeah. Nat preparing, and the different ways that the people around him act towards it. And this line that I think all of us have been having to walk during this time of what is paranoia and what is sensible preparation.
Yeah.
And how those two things look differently depending on the result at the end.
Yeah, and not judge, and the line between judging and not judging your neighbours for their actions and their preparedness. That came across very heavily, and I suppose you get bits of that in the movie, don't you? With Rob Taylor, kind of, and his actions to sort of barricade the family home and stuff. But the short story, most of the focus is on that, isn't it? And there's also a very big focus on his attitude, his and his family's attitudes towards the government, their communications via the wireless in this to the public, and kind of speculation about what may or may not be going on. And you do get, I think this is again Du Maurier's like kind of backbone as a Cornish nationalist, basically, and as someone who, in the relatively small country of England is quite geographically distanced from London. You get the feeling of that kind of cynicism about what the people in the capital are doing, what the people in the towns and the cities are doing, as opposed to, and what the army and the navy might be doing. And it's really mixed in, isn't it, with this, because they do have that kind of English post-war faith to an extent in the particularly in the military, I think. But that faith in the story is not really shown to be justified. It's shown to be a pretty, on a hiding to nowhere, really, in terms of the sort of inexplicable plague that's been visited on them. And I think I mentioned this to you briefly when we were chatting the other day, but one of the things it really reminds me of, which is a product of the late Cold War rather than the early Cold War, is the Raymond Briggs book / animated film When the Wind Blows, which we don't have time to get into properly, but that's all about the kind of like a family, a simple, maybe relatively uneducated family trying to protect themselves using kind of like very loose government guidelines when they're actually quite remote from the help of the government against, I mean, in the case of When the Wind Blows, it's real nuclear war. But there's that sense in the Du Maurier story, I felt, that you're getting these kind of echoes of, as I think the Blitz is probably huge in her mind, but this kind of huge civilization ending threat that the government can not really help you with, that no one can help you with. All the sort of pillars of authority that you, however tentatively, clung to in previous crises are just melting away and are distant,
Yeah, and though, as I said, World War II, I feel looms more over it than the Cold War. There's definitely a line about, are the Russians poisoning the birds or training the birds? And I think that Cold War anxiety comes out more to the fore as time passes, the decade passes, and the film has a little bit more of that. Though personally, I feel like the film has the most similarity to an alien invasion film.
Yeah, it's interesting that, isn't it? Especially when mentioning it to, because I mentioned before, things like I Am Legend and Day of the Triffids, and Day of the Triffids has a sort of mixture of things happening in space that then bring down a kind of domestic, like not domestic, but a kind of homegrown, literally, plague on us. And I Am Legend is more about, kind of supernatural horrors that take on a real world kind of valency. The birds has some of that, and it's it kind of the idea of flocks of birds turning on humanity and attacking. It kind of conjures up everything from kind of biblical plagues all the way to the story that they talk about the sort of resentments these animals might have been feeling for like hundreds of millions of years, don't they? In the kind of closing page, he's talking about that. And I remember I used to joke to an ex-partner about, kind of like we'd be walking through a park and, you'd look at like these really unassuming animals like ducks and, like geese and stuff. And you were like, I'd turn to her, I'd be like, they remember being dinosaurs. If you look in their eyes, you can see they remember being dinosaurs. They're not letting this go without a fight, but it's just so loaded, isn't it? The idea of because I was joking to someone just the other day saying the birds is very scary and very threatening as a concept, and then you kind of think, if it's all birds, that includes kiwis, right? And then I was just like bursting out laughing, thinking of the idea of like in New Zealand, you've got kiwis like waddling fast towards people and you're pecking their ankles. That's presumably part of it that we do not see.
And then I was like, oh, and if the dodo were still alive during, I think the dodo would abstain.
The dodo would be a conscientious objector.
The dodo was too sweet to live.
The dodo didn't live long enough to see the revolution come to pass, but he could have done. So we talked before about the story in terms of Du Maurier's experience with the Blitz and maybe the British experience of the Blitz overall. I think an interesting thing about the birds, the movie, when it comes out, is it comes out just after the Cuban Missile Crisis. So you have that kind of, we talk about the sort of death, the idea of death from the air, and this kind of like sudden kind of devastation of society. Obviously, that would something that would be very much in the American psyche and in the psyche of a lot of the people making this, at the time. And I actually, the scene that made me think of that most markedly was the scene where the kids are fleeing the school, because they even capture it as a fire drill, don't they? But of course, a lot of American kids in this era, their experience of that kind of thing would be the sort of duck and cover drills for, likely nuclear annihilation, which obviously were laughably ineffective. But I mean, do you think that kind of adds to the sort of doomy mood that hangs over the film?
Yeah, I think that definitely movies are such products of their time in ways that even the people making them don't fully comprehend. And the same way that Du Maurier's story is dealing a lot with the Blitz, that there's definitely a lot coming from that Cold War paranoia and not knowing who's the enemy and not knowing where the enemy will come from. Like there was sort of this idea during the Cold War that your next door neighbor could be a Russian spy, and this idea that the birds could be wanting to kill you.
Yeah, no, I think it definitely adds a frisson to it. I just wanted to get more onto the movie. Obviously, we'll talk a little bit about the kind of the making of the movie as we go along, and we'll certainly talk a bit about the background between Hitchcock and Hedren, because I mean, talk about things that could be a whole other podcast, but we'll try our best to do it a bit of justice. So the birds comes in Hitchcock's career it comes out in 1963, and it's his first movie. Yeah, I mean, it's his movie after Psycho. Basically, that's where it falls in his career. As most of the making ofs will let it's getting towards the end of his creative relationship with Bernard Herrmann as well. It's who I believe acted as a kind of supervisor. Consultant, yeah, on this movie.
I mean, the sound in the birds is a really fascinating part of cinema history, and Hitchcock's choice to work with a composer to do the electronics, it is almost a score, but I think that is a fascinating choice that he made. And at least in one making of that I watched, they said that actually Bernard Herrmann was really interested and fascinated by that challenge, and he didn't sort of write it off as lesser than. He really engaged with the challenge of creating a score for a movie that doesn't have a score.
Because that tends to be how people explain the birds to you, isn't it? And it's certainly what struck me as a kid, because I think I probably watched the birds when I was about 10, 11, something like that. And it struck me because I'd already seen other Hitchcock movies, even Psycho, Psycho has a very stirring and bold and kind of subtly avant-garde score itself, really, but it is more of a conventional score, whereas the bird stands out, doesn't it? And there's so many moments in it that I think are more effective and make it feel more modern, and I mean sort of enduringly modern, into our sort of current era of media because of that. There's something that makes it feel, you might, a bit of a lazy label, that something makes it feel maybe a bit more prestige TV in that sense, in the sense that a lot of the shows we watch now, we're kind of used to them not having scores at crucial moments and instead using maybe more diegetic music or, kind of to create atmosphere. But I mean, they used, I can't remember the name of it, but they used something like a sort of proto-primitive synthesizer type thing, didn't they, to create some of the noises that are used for the bird attacks?
Yes, so that they could manipulate the tone and the pitch and all of that.
As well as using live birds on set, of course, not exclusively, but I did read about that. I read that we'll get into some of the horrendous things that the cast had to suffer in this later. I read, because the scenes that involve, live birds being thrown at Tippi Hedren in particular. And I read in researching this, I read that they got a lot of those live gulls, and I think it was like, quote, from a dump in San Francisco. And I was like, well, so they're not like trained birds. They are wild, feral, garbage eating birds. These are like mean guys,
Well, actually, so the garbage dump in San Francisco was where they filmed the flying flocks of seagulls that they then used in the special effects to superimpose on various scenes. And part of it was being able to get large groups of birds, but also to be able to have a vantage point that was above them so that they could get the shots like the either God's eye view or bird's eye view of Bodega Bay and those high angle bird shots. So those gulls were wild. It seems like actually the bird trainer was a pretty fascinating guy, and that a lot of the birds used were trained. In fact, there were a few that were just too well trained and too smart to be used in the film. And then there was apparently one raven or crow that did not like Rod Taylor and would bite him whenever he was around. And actually, that is the one that bites his hand at the very end of the movie. But yeah, there's a whole history with the birds on set, it seems, were perhaps taken better care of than Tippi Hedren was.
Yeah, we'll definitely get into that, yeah.
But the birds and the special effects and all of that was huge to the creation of the film, and something that Hitchcock had never really had to deal with before, special effects to that degree.
One of the things that struck me even when I watched it as a kid, and certainly on rewatch, was and one of the more striking things about The Bird sort of narratively is that it is kind of a stealth horror movie in a way, isn't it? It's kind of, I think I can't remember his name, but the screenwriter who adapted it loosely from the Du Maurier book, I think he talked about it being like a screwball comedy that is invaded by another genre or another form, and I like that, and because I think it was one of the first, obviously I think I'd already seen Psycho, so I was aware of kind of the narrative left turn famously of Janet Leigh's murder in Psycho, but this is kind of like that for genre in a way more, isn't it? It's kind of it kind of because Janet Leigh is in a thriller, like that does not change, but this kind of is different, isn't it? And for all the eeriness of the earlier scenes in The Birds and sort of your introduction to Bodega Bay and all that kind of stuff, you are essentially watching what could be a kind of cheeky, kind of impish, will they, won't they, romantic comedy. I was rewatching this with my mum the other night, and I was saying to her that talk about Hitchcockian experience watching this with your mum, but I was saying to her, everyone in every character in this film ultimately isn't that sinister, but they all come across as hugely sinister, and that's not an accident.
Yeah, I think that was part of Hitchcock's perverse pleasure, was imbuing things that weren't sinister with sinister qualities. Just thinking about in Notorious, the teacup, which actually is sinister in that there's poison in it, but it's such a sort of prosaic thing, an innocent seeming thing, that teacup, but it suddenly takes on a huge significance and terror in how it's used.
And I suppose you get things like the chest in Rope and stuff, don't you? But I think The Birds is almost like a practical joke on that that kind of habit in a way, isn't it? Because it's kind of The Birds, the gag, or one of the gags, kind of is that you're kind of being, even though the title is not misdirecting you and the advertising wasn't misdirecting you, the whole film is kind of misdirecting you into finding threat in these people. And these situations, because Tippi Hedren's character in leaving San Francisco and kind of pursuing Rod Taylor with seemingly mixed motives. I want to talk about her character in a bit, by the way, because I find her a very interesting character in this. She keeps encountering these figures, whether they be Rod Taylor himself, Annie the school teacher, or Mitch's mother, Lydia. She keeps encountering these figures who you kind of you're almost trained by previous Hitchcock movies to see as potentially sinister or even murderous, jealous, possessive, protective, xenophobic, and the townspeople itself, you get kind of like 10 years earlier, but you get kind of little proto Wicker Man vibes from some parts of the movie, don't you, in the sense of being kind of maybe like a big city view of life that is a little bit scared of upstate towns, but yeah, obviously one of the twist essentially is that although this stuff in a different film might be harmful and might be something that the protagonist has to worry about, the thing she has to worry about is this irrationally founded plague from the sky, which none of the characters have any control over, at least not on a conscious level.
One thing that I find interesting about The Birds is that, yes, it is really about these interpersonal relationships, and almost all of them are women. Almost pretty much all of the interesting speaking characters in the film are women, and I'm including Mitch in that. In that he's a little bit dull, but it's quite sort of sensitive look at the interpersonal relationships between women who actually all of them like each other.
Yeah.
They're wary of each other because of the expectations of competitiveness and the expectations of the need for a man's approval and the need for a man. But they themselves all like each other. Even Annie says that the funny thing was that even though Lydia prevented her from pursuing this romance with Mitch, and that fizzled out mostly because of Lydia, that the funny thing was that Lydia liked her. And Lydia likes Melanie.
Yeah.
And Melanie likes both Annie and Lydia and Kathy.
Well, that's so fascinating as the movie goes on, isn't it? Because you, in the sort of later conversations in between bird attacks, you get these like phenomenally generously spirited scenes with Lydia and Melanie, where, you know, who could have been a sort of gothic standard Hitchcock kind of Norma Bates-esque kind of monster figure. She breaks down and talks like quite seriously about grief and loss, and, you know, losing her husband and being fears a bit of inadequacy, and, you know, like her attempts at control that she's partly aware of. And, you know, it's kind of it kind of took me aback this time around, because I was just like, this is such a generous script. Basically, this is, you know, in between, this is essentially an action disaster movie, and like kind of a prototypical one of the genre, you might say, slash horror movie, and it's got time for all this characterization, partly because it's given it the space to breathe at the start, I guess.
And I think that Lydia is a fascinating character in terms of Hitchcock's, because I feel like a lot of times people like to really simplify the archetypes of Hitchcock's films and sort of the demon mother figure, which actually doesn't so much appear in too many of his films. He himself was complicating that. And the icy blonde, again, people raise that up to some sort of thing that is in all of his films, but he's constantly complicating these archetypes that we expect from his films. And Lydia is incredibly complex and actually quite sympathetic. She's aware that her relationship with her son is a little toxic, but she doesn't know what else to do because she's so scared of being left. And that's a sympathetic thing, and that people can do some damage while still being aware of it, and also needing the complicated, messy human emotions are there, and that people aren't just straightforward bad or good, that they have these shades of gray. I did find it interesting that, as I was saying before, that most of the interesting characters are women, and the sort of fact that in British slang, the birds can also apply to be a slang word for women.
Yeah, your beard. Yeah, that's I like that.
So
you know, actually, Hitchcock would have been aware of that.
Yeah. That's part of why I was thinking that. I'm like, that is definitely a pun that Hitchcock would have appreciated. And the fact that, honestly, the sort of more melodramatic parts of it, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way, but just the straight up melodrama, and then also the comedic parts of it, could also be legitimately called, in a kind of flippant way, the birds as well.
Well, if you had brought out the birds, but you were trying to hide the fact that it was a secret horror movie, you would call it like The Women, wouldn't you? And then you'd have the bird attack happen halfway through. One thing that this started to remind me of a little bit, you know, I mentioned Alien up front just for the coincidence of Veronica Cartwright's involvement, because obviously she plays Lambert in Alien, the only other actress in Alien apart from Sigourney Weaver. one movie that this reminded me of that came after this, far after this, was actually not so much Alien itself, but Aliens, in the sense that you've got that kind of female protagonist going into a dangerous situation. Other than that, she's more aware of how dangerous the situation is going to be, but dealing with this kind of force of nature onslaught. But also kind of, there's a lot been written about Aliens and what it's, whether it's a progressive movie or not in terms of, examining mother roles and surrogate mother roles and things like that. But you kind of, in this, you kind of get Melanie's exploration of what Mitch's mother means to her, as much as what it means to Mitch, really, don't you? And you also get her obviously maybe in a more Aliens-esque way, kind of becoming a surrogate mother figure or another mother figure to the girl. But it's got so much to say about sort of female interrelationships, as you were saying. And you're right, the kind of Rod Taylor, not to rubbish Rod Taylor or anything, is a perfectly adequate leading man in this and the Time Machine, but he is kind of the least interesting character, isn't he? And he's kind of more like a sort of object in some ways, isn't he? Like he's of fascination and of sort of proxy trading between the women in the film.
And I think that is actually quite typical of a lot of Hitchcock films, where the female characters, and this also is part of Hitchcock's complicated legacy, because the female characters in his films are often the most active and the most interesting. And I think that there is a lot of credit goes to Alma Revel Hitchcock, who was a deep collaborator with him and did a lot of work on the scripts and was almost uncredited producer on a lot of the films, and had a profound influence on the films. There also was the fact that he worked with a lot of source material written by women. In the case of The Birds with Daphne Du Maurier, even though he didn't really take too much of the story, but the source is from Daphne Du Maurier, or also worked with a large number of female screenwriters. And actually, half of Hitchcock's films either were adapted from a book by or a short story by a woman, or had a woman screenwriter on them. And then there's the fact of Joan Harrison, his assistant, who then worked up into screenwriting and then became one of the few women producers in the 1940s, credited producer, and was really in charge of Alfred Hitchcock Presents. There is this complicated thing in Hitchcock's relations with women, in that in some ways he was quite encouraging and supportive of ambitious women who wanted to be in the film world and who wanted to tell stories. And though you do see a drop off in the number of women screenwriters and source material in the later part of his career, which I do think is significant as well.
Yeah.
So.
Well, we'll get a little bit, less than, I think we're just, eulogizing Hitchcock as this tremendous progressive, at least marquee name, and all the useful drag he had on women working in the industry. We will get a bit more into the behind the scenes story of the Birds and to an extent Marnie in a second. Just before we get onto that, I just wanted to talk a little bit more about the Birds itself and kind of like some of the scenes in it and kind of aspects of it that fascinate me to this day. There were so many, like watching this, there were so many scenes that were just so beautiful when I was rewatching it, and I'm not just talking about the landscapes, although obviously the way they use kind of, Bodega Bay and as a setting is great and foreboding and atmospheric, etc. But we were talking about the composite effects of the bird attacks and the kind of some of the shots in this just took my breath away this time around. Like it was everything from there's the kind of like borderline iconic one where that's to do with the diner scene, where they're all taking cover in the diner and they're having this talk about what might be happening and why. But then it cuts, when it starts kicking off again, it cuts to that high shot with all the animated birds in it, and just the bird song, and you're watching the fire rage down below, and everything like that. It's amazing. One of the shots I didn't remember being as stunning as it was I think it's the scene when the birds first come down the chimney at the house. And they're fighting them off, and then they successfully exit the room, and you're just left in the room for like a good kind of 10 seconds, just like in that sort of maelstrom of bird effects and noise. it's really, it's surreal. It's almost like being inside a sort of malevolent snow globe, you know. It's really, I just didn't remember that shot being as bracing as it was, you know. But I mean, are there any bits, you know, if you had to pick sort of favorite or sort of most impactful bits in The Birds, have you got any favorites?
Just in terms of shots, there are some great ones in terms of the people in the foreground and the people in the midground and in the background, and the way that they interact or don't interact, like the conversation between Mitch and the sheriff going on in the midground after the bird attack in the living room. And technically that's what the scene's about, but actually what the scene is about is in the foreground, Lydia picking up the broken teacups and Melanie watching her do that. And there's another, in the last bird attack scene in the dark, there's a moment when you start on, I forget if it's Lydia or Melanie in the back in a close-up, and it pulls, I think it's Lydia, and then it pulls back and Mitch is revealed, and then Melanie, I think. And just the way Hitchcock used space and the way he allowed visually one to see the interactions between the characters and what the characters were thinking about each other. You mentioned earlier how Hitchcock bridges the time between silent film and talkies, and he really is in many ways a silent filmmaker. The dialogue in his films is always very good, but he always made sure that he was visually telling the story. And as a screenwriter, I really, really admire that economy that he's able to use, which also comes down to his writers as well, but the virtuosity of his ability to tell a story visually. There are long stretches of The Birds where no one says anything, and you know exactly what's going on. And that, I think, is a really stunning thing about it. It is almost a silent film, which also has these very memorable dialogue scenes as well.
It's on the, as well as having these earlier influences from his career, his long career at this stage. It's also kind of perched, and I use that word advisedly, on the one of the fault lines, or at least coming fault lines, between kind of what you might call classic Hollywood and new Hollywood as well, isn't it? You know, it's kind of, it's obviously a bit early for Bonnie and Clyde, etc., but it's kind of getting there, so that just aesthetically it's starting to look a bit more like what we consider to be kind of auteurist Hollywood, getting out of the classical studio system. It's right there on that edge, in a way that all Hitchcock's kind of mid-60s movies are. I mean, I was going to bring up the climbing frame scene because
I was just thinking that myself. I was like, oh yeah, and it's not very original of me, but that jungle gym scene is amazing.
It doesn't need to be original with you in this sense. I think you're allowed a few predictable choices. It's so startling that I was joking to my mum watching it that well, not joking, even just sort of suggesting that, because it's so tempting to sort of rewrite movies in your head sometimes, isn't it, even when they're great movies. But I was just thinking, well, I can imagine a different version of The Birds where the sort of left turn into horror survival apocalyptic movie is even starker, where you haven't had any of the prefiguring of the birds, like attacks or, you know, like anything like that has happened thus far, and you watch the whole movie up to that point where she goes to the school. Obviously she'd have a different pretext for going to the school, just like picking her up just as a routine thing or something, and they go there, and that's when it starts. Like that the climbing frame thing is your signal to the audience that it's starting, and then the attack happens for the first time. And I'm not saying that'd be a better movie, I'm just saying that I kind of think that would work too, you know, like that'd be interesting. Of course, you know, she wouldn't then be scared, you know, it'd be the audience kind of knowledge and the eeriness of the children's voices that would kind of signal to you that this wasn't right, you know. But I do love that scene. I love the way it follows on to the evacuation of the school, and that whole mad rush down, kind of like it was flowing like a river of children kind of being attacked in various kind of close-ups and long shots by the birds, is really kind of overwhelming, isn't it? It's not even comes down to how scary it is to a modern audience or anything. It's just there's so much going on, and it's so dynamic, you know.
It's just in terms of the editing and the sound effects, and it's there to overwhelm you. One funny thing back to the schoolhouse is that my sister actually lived in Bodega Bay for several years, and technically the schoolhouse is in Bodega rather than Bodega Bay, but she lived fairly near the schoolhouse, and apparently there are a lot of vultures in Bodega. And the vultures really do like to perch on the fence around the schoolhouse and stretch their wings in this incredibly ominous, and like rows of them.
Wow.
And I think that they may be playing up to the tourists.
Yes, yeah, I can imagine.
Also
They outlawed singing "Nickety Nackety Now." That's illegal in that county, you know.
But I think the vultures are also a little jealous because they don't actually get featured in the birds at all. There are no vultures, but they figure that they will play the role of all of the birds and the birds for the tourists that come to see the schoolhouse in Bodega.
Whatever keeps the economy going this year, you know, whatever selling points they've got. I visited. I've only been to the States 3 times in my life. Actually, the first time I went to the States, I was 11, and we went to Universal Studios, and I saw the Psycho house on the hill. So I must have seen Psycho by the time I was 11, because I remember, you know, squeeing over that basically. But the last time I went to the States was I went to California about a year ago, and we were in San Francisco, and we actually went as far as just north of the Golden Gate Bridge briefly. But I was actually kind of fanboying a little bit, because I was kind of like, oh, this is, you know, like this is getting kind of towards Bodega Bay. You know, I didn't make it up there, but I was getting, you know, as a birds fan, I was getting really kind of hyped about the fact that I was relatively geographically proximate to it. I mean, there's loads more stuff we could talk about the movie itself, but and we might get into some of that. But I just wanted to turn a little bit to the, you know, the behind the scenes stuff that is here about Alfred Hitchcock and Tippi Hedren, who was making her movie debut in The Birds, wasn't she? You mentioned Alma, Hitchcock's wife. They kind of discovered her together, didn't they? In a I think in retrospect slightly creepy way, but I believe that was the way they did bring up a lot of kind of new talent.
She had Tippi Hedren had been a model, and a very successful one, and she was in a commercial that was on television at the time. And one interesting thing is that when Melanie Daniels is introduced in The Birds, and she's crossing the street in San Francisco, and she walks by a little boy who whistles at her, and she turns back and smiles. That is a deliberate pop culture reference to the advertisement that she was in. That's what happens in the advertisement, which made more sense to me watching it this time, where I'm like, oh, because I don't feel like that's a very natural reaction. It is kind of like a commercial reaction. And I feel like it's a combination of things. It's explicitly reminding people going to the cinema where they have seen this woman before, with Tippi Hedren. It's referencing her history as a model. And I think that it's setting people up to underestimate her, and then sort of, or at least expectations can then be subverted afterwards. But I also think that it can be interpreted in multiple ways, and in some way it's also a little bit mean-spirited to be referencing directly a commercial that she was in as sort of, this is the starting point and look what we've done with her. And the fact is that I firmly believe that Tippi Hedren is responsible for Tippi Hedren's performance in The Birds. The fact that Alfred Hitchcock is a great director definitely is part of that, but there are plenty of people that do not have the natural magnetism and skill that Tippi Hedren shows in the film The Birds.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good performance. I think it's a very good performance. I mean, one of the things I love about Tippi Hedren's performance in this as Melanie, and I noticed it much more on rewatch this time, is, you know, the little hints you get, and I think it's a testimony of how good the script is, actually, is like the little hints you get of her life before the events of The Birds. You know, like it's usually when she's being interrogated by Mitch, you know, in various scenes, but also she's talking to Annie. talking to Lydia. But you know, the sort of incident about her, you know, apparently getting naked in a fountain in Rome and things like that, and she
wasn't
sort of
naked.
Yes,
She was pushed in that fountain.
Yeah, the fact that she's seemingly this figure of kind of like, you know, at least local tabloid renown, you know, and sort of disapproval. I'd forgotten some of that, and I thought it was interesting when there's a conversation where she has with Mitch, where she's talking about like kind of the things she was like, the crowd she was with in Rome, and like how she's changed and how she's different now. And I actually thought it's nicely low key there in the subtext, but you know, because Melanie's actually quite an interesting character, you know, it's like the whole bugbear, the interesting female character, you know, but she's quite erratic. You know, the way she acts is quite erratic. She obviously has impulse control issues. She does things that could be considered quite eccentric, borderline, you know, harassing in terms of following Mitch all the way to his weekend home. You know, I was thinking that, and I don't think it's definitely not text in the movie. I was thinking an interesting subtext is she kind of displays some of the features of a recovering addict. You know, she acts in some ways that are like that, where she's someone who's is aware she has these impulses, but is trying to keep control. And I thought that was really something I'd never picked up on before, and I kind of like that as a take on her, you know.
Yeah, I also find it interesting that part of the way that she takes control of them is through work, and she describes what her schedule is. And Mitch is shocked that she's working at all, like she's the socialite, but yeah, that she goes through what her schedule is, and that she saves Friday for running into men in bird shops. But
yeah. Well, that's the cliche of addicts trying to keep themselves busy, isn't it? You know?
Yeah. But yeah, she really is a fascinating, complex character that defies easy categorization, and is a big part of why the birds work, is because of the character of Melanie Daniels.
Yeah, no, I fully support that. I'd actually forgotten how kind of upsetting it is towards the end of the movie, The Birds, when she's been attacked by the birds in the upstairs room, and she's kind of borderline catatonic for the rest of the movie. You know, like is it like about 10-15 minutes at the end there where she's kind of out of it, you know, and she's traumatized. And I think actually the trauma of her and the trauma that Veronica Cartwright portrays in it as well is very startling for a film of its era, you know, because I mean, you even get, you know, I think I mentioned Night of the Living Dead before, you know, but you get a little bit of that in Night of the Living Dead a few years later. Was it like five years after this, where, you know, the Barbara, you know, is shell shocked for large portions of the film after the initial you know, attack at the beginning. But it felt to me it felt very real in the Birds. Would you like to talk? I mean, you know, I'll throw in some stuff, you know, in this happy undertaking, but would you like to talk a little bit about the kind of less nice side of Hitchcock and Hedren's relationship?
Well, it is a very sad and disturbing relationship and story. And I think that the fact that Tippi Hedren was a first-time actress was a big part of it. Because people like Kim Novak and Doris Day and Grace Kelly would say that they had nothing but lovely experiences with Hitchcock. And the fact is, they were all stars already. And the fact that Tippi Hedren really was coming from a position of not knowing how the movie industry worked, and there are aspects of the relationship where she's like, I did learn a huge amount from Hitchcock and from Alma Revel, and having him as an acting coach in some ways was very beneficial. But there were these aspects to it where he became obsessed with her, which is something that he acknowledges actually in one of the interviews that he did with Truffaut, though he's acknowledging it entirely from his point of view. And is because the interviews that Hitchcock did with Truffaut were done during the post-production of The Birds, so it was all very rough and real. And so Hitchcock talks about how he went off the deep end with The Birds, and for the first time he was like, the crew was looking at me like I was crazy. And I feel like this is all very telling. He doesn't quite realize, it's a little bit him being like, and poor me. And I'm like, and how do you think Tippi felt about it? But in that, he says that he had to teach her how to act and had to basically give the performance for her, which I think is a lie because she is the one actually doing the acting. But that it was an intensive studying thing, and he calls himself a Svengali in it. And this sort of Svengali relationship is always a completely unhealthy one, and also completely undermines the faith in the skill of the typically the woman who is being created in this Pygmalion-like way, the agency of the woman. And I feel like a lot of times with these directors that feel that in order to get a great performance out of an actor, you need to make them feel like they're there. It's kind of the opposite of the method actor thing, of kind of the method director. And usually when you think of the sort of notorious cases of this, it's Shelley Duvall in The Shining, with Kubrick isolating her entirely from the cast. But it means that the director takes credit for the performance that the actress had to go through hell in order to give. And you're like, just trust them to act. And I think that this comes from often this sort of sexist idea that women are instinctual and men are skilled. So you need to sort of trigger in a woman like her instinctive response. Yeah, in Last Tango in Paris, another example of that, where if you just let Maria Shriver act, she would have been able to do it. And a lot of these times, it's women who have not acted a lot. And then, so Tippi had to deal with this sort of method director thing going on, and also the fact that Hitchcock was sexually harassing her.
Yeah, I was going to
well.
say we should probably just state, you know, what most accounts seem to agree happened was not fully up to, you know, sexual intercourse or interaction between them, but heavy harassment, controlling behavior, abuse, you know, verbal abuse, certainly, controlling behavior up to and including not letting her travel later on when they were talking about, you know, I think that was getting into Marnie, but you know, this kind of control, but open sexual propositioning, I believe.
About when the first filming began, and you saw that, I mean, she's in practically every scene, as you know, and the demands were considerable, just the technical demands.
Well, not only the technical demands of it, but the fact that I was the leading female in a film that the studio didn't think Hitch should have picked me for. Why would, and their question was, why would you pick an unknown to take on a lead that is as strong as this? And so I was bucking a lot of negativeness from the studio heads, which was extremely difficult. And had Hitchcock not given me the assurance that I could do this role, I rather doubt whether I could have done it. And all of those feelings went extremely well for months. You know, The Birds took 6 months to film. And it wasn't until the very ending of the filming that I started noticing that he kept watching me, staring at me. And whether we were on the set or whatever, he'd be standing off, talking to people, carrying on a conversation, and staring at me. Eventually that becomes almost like stalking. And it was a very uncomfortable situation. And I became very, very good at getting out I would always have somewhere to go, had to be somewhere, had something to do, had to have a meeting with makeup, had to have a meeting with whatever I could think of to get out of a situation. And at the same time, I was having an incredibly wonderful time acting and doing this role. I mean, it was an incredible opportunity and a responsibility that was enormous, and I treasured it. And I kept hoping that this encroachment would stop. And after The Birds was, we were finished with it, then there was a period of time where nothing was happening, excepting that they were started to prepare Marnie. And it was during the filming of Marnie. In fact, I remember exactly the scene that Rod Taylor and I were doing. We were up on the bluff where we are talking about our mothers, you know, and it was that scene when Hitch's agent told me that I was going to play Marnie. It was he who, not Hitch, it was the agent.
But then, of course, in addition to being in practically every sequence of Marnie, then the situation became really, really intolerable, didn't it?
It did. Yeah, it did. I don't know if any of you women have had the horrible experience of being the object of someone's obsession. Have any of you? I don't know whether you'd even answer that, but if you have, you would know exactly what that is like, and it is oppressive and frightening, and you find out that you've been followed, and you find out that your handwriting has been analyzed, and you find out that you're being spied upon and made demands that you would never acquiesce under any circumstance. And it becomes a situation of not being able to deal with it, not wanting to deal with it, and not dealing with it. Or I should say I dealt with it by becoming a master at getting out of the room, having a reason to get out of the room, and so that I wouldn't have to be alone with him.
And so the situation that she was in was kind of an impossible one because he had all the power. And in some ways, he was giving her quite a lot in terms of experience in the movie industry and knowledge. But it came at such a huge cost as well. And Tippi Hedren, in interviews that were done after the HBO movie of the filming of The Birds and Marnie, called The Girl, because Hitchcock really creepily only refers to Tippi as the girl. And I do want to point out, Tippi Hedren was 31 when he met her.
Yeah.
She was fully a woman. There's nothing like Melanie Daniels in The Birds is such a grown woman character. She is not a girl.
It's one of the other things about his fixation, isn't it? Because I mean, although Hitchcock obviously is getting what it is like mid-late 60s, I think at that point, so he is you know, about double her age, let's say. But it is a strange fixation to. I mean, I'm not excusing anything. You know, obviously, if you acted this way to an 18-year-old woman, you're not being a good person either. But that is maybe there's kind of more explanation to why you might twist a relationship like that, a quasi-paternal relationship, into something like this. but yeah, fixating that stuff like on a grown-up woman who, as you say, was a kind of, you know, a novice in terms of the film industry, but certainly not a novice in terms of working or having her own identity or anything like that. It's I mean, it's baffling and sad and pathetic and horrible, isn't it?
Yeah.
I was just thinking, even in terms of his previous films, it's almost like anyone who thinks that directors get to know themselves and become better people through their work might have a big counterexample in the fact that Hitchcock could make Vertigo and then do this.
And I think that's a good idea.
Yeah, you know what would go really well? Controlling and manipulating and creating a blonde woman against her will, and, you know, that being good for my mental health and everything.
But one thing Tippi has said in interviews after, that it wasn't continuous. Like, there were times when he was charming, when he was engaging, when the relationship was fine. And I think that is really important to remember about these abusive relationships. That's not to in any way excuse him. It's to remind people that abusive relationships are almost never continually abusive.
No.
And
They wouldn't be,
Tippi Hedren said
they wouldn't have the space to become relationships in that sense. Yeah.
And she said that if it actually were the way it was in the HBO movie The Girl, which in general she felt was pretty accurate, but she was like, you had to fit everything into 90 minutes. And if it were actually that way in real life, I would have left. Like, that there were good times. There were times when she really did feel like he was mentoring her and that it wasn't abusive. And that's how abusers get to people.
Yeah.
And that's also how abusers don't realize that they're abusers as well.
I think that's a crucial part of it. I was I picked up it's a book I had when I was at university, which is the even then quite old biography Hitch, which came out in 1978. It was written by John Russell Taylor. It came out when Hitchcock was still alive. Hitchcock died in 1980. And I was reading the sort of, you know, 20 or so pages that deal with the Birds and Marnie in that. And obviously it was a different time, but I was rereading it now, and it's kind of it's not overtly sexist in many respects. You know, Taylor's account of this period, but it's one of those things that when you know all this behind the scenes stuff, there are massive gaps. And I'm not saying those are Taylor's fault as an author necessarily, although, you know, we can question how deep his research was allowed to go. But there seems like a kind of, you can read loads of like euphemisms, and there's loads of bits where he uses phrases or like, you know, he points out that, you know, for some reason, Hedren and Hitchcock got into a mood with each other and didn't speak for 3 months directly, except through proxies. And but then he doesn't seem to drill down any further, or, you know, like say why might that have been? I wonder, you know. And there's all these kind of like omissions. You know, it comes across as a sort of history of omissions, you know. And I think it's film criticism and film biography from a different era, you know, because some of the most depressing aspects of this, when I was reading up about them, are kind of the very, very Harvey Weinstein-esque kind of long tail of this kind of professional abuse, isn't it? Because Hitchcock also, after making Marnie, which is freighted with weirdly coded abuse fantasies, you know, he didn't work with her again. They didn't make another film together, but he did prevent her making films. He blocked her. Yeah, he blocked approaches from was it from like Goddard, or, you know, like various people that she might have wanted to work with, or at least have the say on working with. And that's kind of, you know, when you read up about Harvey Weinstein and Hitchcock in this case, those are the kinds of bits that are almost the most, and they're not necessarily the most horrible, but they're sort of the most pathetic, aren't they? They're kind of they're
the
amongst
retaliatory
them. Yeah, the stuff done almost like in what should be the cold light of day. You know what I mean? Like when you should have at least gained distance from the sort of perverse and passionate situation you were in. But you still keep doing it, you know, like as a policy, as something that secretaries have to connive in and have to, and, you know, your assistants have to help you with and stuff like that. And it's horrible. It's when you become a sort of general of abuse, isn't it? When you're commanding a sort of small army that helps you carry out continuing abuse and neglect and, you know, control. It's horrible. It's horrible. Sorry, not a nice note to leave the podcast on, but it's horrible, isn't it?
But I do think that Marnie, as a film, also in some ways fully legitimizes Tippi Hedren as an actress, because, as you said, during the filming of Marnie, there were long stretches where she and Hitchcock were not directly communicating. And in Marnie, she gives a very different performance than in The Birds, and an equally fascinating one. So this idea that somehow Tippi Hedren was sort of this puppet with Hitchcock pulling the strings. And I think that's partially enforced by the fact that because Hitchcock blackballed her, her career did stall after having these two towering performances in two great films, both directed by Hitchcock. But the fact is that, and I do think that Hitchcock is a great director, and I think that he did have an influence, certainly, on Tippi Hedren's performances, but it gets overstated. And that in Marnie, she was a little bit on her own for creating that character and that performance. And it is a pretty fascinating performance. She is a really interesting, fascinating screen presence.
I think Marnie, for all I didn't much care for Marnie, but that's so dismissive, isn't it? You feel like you can't just say that about Hitchcock movies. I thought it had a weaker script. I thought it was kind of boring, especially in the second half. And I thought, but by weaker script, I mean, you know, a lot of the dialogue came across, however it came across in 1963, it came across as like terribly dated and like banal now.
That sort of obsession with psychiatry that is a little dated these days. What I found interesting watching Marnie is partway through, I'm like, wow, this is actually a little bit of gender flipped Spellbound.
Oh, right, yeah.
And actually, Spellbound's not one of my favorites. And the whole sort of psychobabble thing is really dated and hard to suspend one's disbelief for. But I do think Marnie has some really interesting aspects to it in terms of the character herself, who is a really fascinating character. I think that then at the end, having it all come down to childhood trauma is, by today's standards, a little bit trite.
Yeah,
I think by the standards of the day that it was released in, it was more sort of fresh and shocking. So it's an imperfect film, I think, but I had been putting off watching it because I didn't like the description. And I think that there is a lot more to it than just the sort of psychobabble aspect of it.
Yeah, it's not an easy watch, but I didn't particularly find it an enjoyable watch either. But it's very interesting. It also doubled as my sort of farewell to Sean Connery, of course, given that he passed away recently. It made Marnie the same, or Marnie came out the same year he made Goldfinger as well, which is a big year for him. Tippi Hedren is still alive, of course. She's a 90-year-old woman now, and
still sounds exactly the same.
Yeah, I know. She just does have a great voice.
I was watching a 1999 making of documentary for The Birds, and she very savvily, as a former model and an actress, knows the importance of costuming, is wearing for the interview a pistachio-colored suit. And I'm like, yes, that is a savvy person that knows the power of image. And she is like, I'm going to be talking about The Birds. I'm going to channel Melanie Daniels.
Well, you can't forget the modeling nous, that you get in the younger years. Well, that was fascinating, Nannina. Thanks for talking through The Birds with me. I mean, there's so much more to touch on, just even if you're just limiting yourself to that movie, But I hope we gave people who have seen it, a bit of a sort of welcome refresh on it. And obviously, love to hear your thoughts on Twitter or by email if you are rewatching it. And anyone who hasn't seen it, probably don't listen to this first. That's the too late spoiler warning. But do go and watch it. It's great. And thanks for coming on the show. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I can't believe I nearly let you go there, Nannina, without actually asking what your 5 favorite movies in 5 minutes were. Let's hear it.
It was my fiendish plot to try to slip out the back door.
You nearly got away.
Yeah. Well, so these are not definitive.
Yes, they are.
Changing.
They are now. Yes. They're fully definitive.
But in no particular order, I think that I would have to say Fitzcarraldo, Return of the Jedi, Dance Girl Dance, How to Steal a Million, and Point Break.
I've not seen 3 of those.
Which ones haven't you seen?
So I've seen Fitzcarraldo.
Of course.
I've seen Return of the Jedi, and I've not seen the other 3.
Oh, so Dance Girl Dance is Dorothy Arzner's masterpiece, and it's from 1940, and it just the showing of the complicated relationships between women who are really set on goals in terms of their careers and the different ways that they can approach that. And in this case, it's in the world of dance. And it's not just like catty backstage backstabbing things. There's a lot of support for each other while also a lot of using each other. And it's wonderfully complex, and there is an amazing, justifiably famous scene where Maureen O'Hara takes on her audience and talks directly to them towards the end. It's a fascinating film and just so entertaining and funny, and yes, it's a great film. And then How to Steal a Million is William Wyler, Peter O'Toole, Audrey Hepburn, in the world of art thieving. Like
that sells itself, really, doesn't it? And obviously I've heard of Point Break, so
and you haven't seen Point Break.
I know, that's weird. Yeah, we all have our deficiencies, our blind spots, but I'll get to it, don't worry. I'll a bunch of presidents trying to pull off a heist right now sounds like just what I need as therapy.
No, Point Break is excellent, and Catherine Bigelow just has such a strong visual sense and really loves fire and films fire so beautifully.
She said unworryingly.
I have one sort of honorable mention because it's a short, but probably my favorite half hour ever committed to celluloid is Wendy Toy's In the Picture, which is a great little bit of supernatural horror comedy from 1953.
Oh, well, if we get a half hour, I'll have The Wrong Trousers then by Aardman.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that was allowed. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for asking me.
Yeah, not at all.
Yeah, been lovely getting to chat with you again.
Yeah, hasn't it been a pleasure? Yeah, and we have to take what pleasures we can this year, so let's appreciate it. Well, and that's been the show. So from me, David, bye-bye, and Nannina,
bye.
See you soon. You've been listening to the EscapeGoat podcast, hosted by David Fagiani. If you want to contact the podcast with any feedback or thoughts, you can leave comments on our Libsyn page or under our YouTube videos, or email us at escapegoatpod@gmail.com. You can also reach the show on Twitter on @egoat_pod and follow us for new episode notifications, or get me personally on @d_Fagiani. This podcast is available on YouTube, Apple Podcasts and Spotify, as well as our Libsyn site, escapegoatpodcast.libsyn.com. Original intro, outro, and any other incidental music for this podcast is composed, produced, and made available by permission of Richard Gilbert.